31 years old, and not a single offer. Lucettes' laughter filled the ballroom like something thrown and shattered. Guests leaned closer as she lifted her hand beneath the chandelier, turning her wrist slowly, so the sapphire caught every flame above. The stone was enormous, deep blue, ringed with tiny diamonds that scattered light across the nearest faces like cold stars. "Bertram had it brought from Ceylon," she announced, loud enough for servants standing near the far wall to hear. The jeweler told him a stone this rare surfaces once in a generation. Several women gasped. One clutched her own modest ring instinctively. Solène set down her wineglass and smiled from across the table with the kind of warmth that always carried a blade inside it. "How wonderful for you, Lucette. 3 daughters settled beautifully." She let the silence hang for exactly 1 breath too long. A pity we could not manage all 4. Soft laughter moved through the guests like wind through dead leaves. Fenella tilted her head and pressed her lips together in a look she had perfected over the years, something between pity and amusement designed to wound without leaving evidence. "Perhaps a country clergyman may still come calling," she offered gently. "Widowers can be surprisingly open-minded about age." More laughter. Louder now. Evelina stood near the edge of the room, holding a glass of wine she had not touched, wearing a dark navy gown that seemed designed to help her disappear against the curtains behind her. She kept her expression still. She had learned years ago that any visible reaction only made it worse. Then, Lord Harland Danthorpe rose slowly from the head of the table, lifting his glass toward Lucette. The room quieted immediately. "This family has much to celebrate tonight," he declared. "Every daughter of this house has honored the Danthorpe name through loyalty, grace, and wise alliance." His gaze swept across the table. It passed over Evelina without stopping, as though she were a chair left slightly out of place that someone would eventually move. The room understood perfectly. Evelina set her glass down carefully and turned toward the ballroom door. Her fingers had gone cold. Her chest ached with the familiar pressure of words swallowed so many times they had begun to calcify somewhere beneath her ribs. But as she reached for the door handle, a voice cut through the laughter behind her. "Is that the Duke of Ashgrove?" The name moved through the ballroom like a crack spreading across ice. Conversation stopped. Music faltered. Several women stepped physically backward while mothers reached for their daughters with tight, anxious hands. Evelina turned. He stood at the far end of the ballroom near the towering windows, entirely alone. Tall, dark-haired, dressed in black from his collar to his boots. No one stood within 10 feet of him. Guests moved around him the way water moves around a stone in a river, carefully, instinctively, without ever getting close. And for a reason Evelina could not yet explain, she did not walk through the door behind her. She walked toward him. But before we discover what happened when she reached him, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you truly want to support us, you can use super thanks below. Your support helps us continue creating these unforgettable stories every single day. Now, let us begin. Danthorpe Hall had once been described by a visiting diplomat as the kind of house that reminded you of your own insignificance. It rose from the Somerset countryside like something grown rather than built, with limestone walls stained gold by 2 centuries of English weather, chimneys climbing in rows above the slate rooftops, and windows so tall that candlelight from inside could be seen from nearly a mile across the fields on winter evenings. The ground stretched endlessly in every direction. Manicured gardens gave way to wild meadows, which surrendered to ancient oak forests that had stood since before the Danthorpe name appeared in any record book. Gravel pathways wound between clipped hedges, stone fountains, and ornamental ponds where swans drifted in slow circles through the autumn fog. Lord Harland Danthorpe governed the estate and its reputation with the same cold precision a general might use to govern a garrison. Every piece of silver was inventoried. Every dinner guest was selected for strategic value. Every marriage negotiated within the family was treated not as a union of hearts, but as a treaty between houses. And Lord Harland expected each treaty to bring measurable returns in status, wealth, or political connection. Lady Purnell supported this vision with quieter tools. She controlled social invitations, supervised her daughter's wardrobes and friendships with exacting care, and ensured that every public appearance by the Danthorpe family reflected precisely the image her husband demanded. Purnell never raised her voice. She never needed to. Disappointment from Lady Purnell arrived through silence, through a glance held 1 second too long, through the careful rearrangement of seating so that the person being punished found themselves placed farther from the center of importance. Evelina had been seated at the far end of the table for nearly 3 years. Now she woke each morning before the rest of the household, when the hallways were still dark and the kitchen fires had barely caught. She reviewed the day's schedule with the head housekeeper, confirmed deliveries with the cook, inspected guest rooms before visitors arrived, and resolved disputes among servants who were too frightened of Lord Harland to bring problems directly to him. She arranged flowers in the drawing room. She counted linens before laundering. She balanced household accounts that Lady Purnell had quietly stopped reviewing once Evelina proved faster and more accurate. None of this carried a title. None of it earned her a place at the family's inner circle. She existed inside Danthorpe Hall, the way a supporting beam exists inside a wall. Essential, invisible, and entirely taken for granted. One October afternoon, a visiting baroness arrived for tea and found Evelina adjusting silver candlesticks along the mantelpiece in the drawing room. "You there," the woman called briskly, not looking up from removing her gloves. "What? Would you tell Lady Purnell that Baroness Cavendish has arrived, and bring a fresh pot of Darjeeling?" The last girl brewed it far too weak. Evelina straightened politely. "Of course, Baroness. I will let my mother know you are here." The woman's face flushed immediately, but before she could stammer an apology, Selena swept into the room and laughed brightly. "Oh, do not worry, Baroness. Even we forget sometimes." The laughter that followed was polite, but it stayed with Evelina long after the Baroness departed. Even we forget sometimes, as though she had become so unremarkable inside her own home that being mistaken for hired help was simply amusing rather than devastating. The only room where Evelina still felt like herself stood at the end of a long corridor on the second floor, past 2 unused guest chambers and a narrow staircase that most of the household had forgotten existed. The estate library occupied a wide, quiet space beneath a ceiling painted with fading clouds. Tall shelves lined every wall from floor to molding, packed with leather-bound volumes collected by 4 generations of Danthorpes who had cared far more about appearances than reading. Most of the books were damaged. Cracked spines, foxed pages, bindings pulling away from signatures after decades of neglect in a room no one visited. Evelina had begun repairing them in the years after Emery's death. After everything, she taught herself from a manual she found buried in the bottom shelf near the east window. She learned to mix wheat paste, to ease apart pages stuck together by damp, to restitch gatherings using linen thread and a curved needle. The work required patience and steady hands and absolute attention, which was exactly what she needed during the months when grief threatened to swallow every waking hour. Now the library had become her private country. She spent stolen hours there between household duties, working beneath the tall windows while gray light moved slowly across the reading table. The smell of old paper and linen paste and faintly of the lavender she kept in a jar beside the inkwell. Nobody disturbed her there because nobody cared about old books gathering dust on shelves. Nobody opened. One rainy morning, while crossing the courtyard between the main house and the stable block to deliver a message to the head groom, Evelina noticed a boy sitting alone behind the water trough. He was perhaps 10 years old, thin and shivering, pressing a bundled rag against his forearm. A deep red stain had soaked through the cloth and was dripping steadily onto the wet gravel beneath him. Evelina knelt immediately, What happened? The boy flinched. His name was Regan, the youngest stable hand, hired only a month earlier. He had cut his arm on a rusted hinge while cleaning a stall gate, and he was terrified that reporting the injury would cost him his position. "Please do not tell Mr. Karn," he whispered, his voice trembling. "He said, if I caused trouble during the first season, he would send me back." Avelina examined the wound carefully. It was deep enough to need proper cleaning, but not so deep that it required a surgeon. "Come with me," she said gently. She brought him to the kitchen entrance where the air was warm, and asked the cook for clean linen, a basin of boiled water, and the jar of honey salve kept in the pantry for burns. She cleaned the wound personally, wrapped it firmly, and gave him a cup of warm broth and half a currant scone she had hidden in her apron from the breakfast tray. "If Mr. Cairn gives you any difficulty, you come find me," she told him quietly. "You are not trouble, Rega. You are a boy who got hurt doing honest work. There is nothing shameful in that." The child nodded, blinking hard against tears he was trying desperately not to shed. Nobody inside the main house ever learned about the incident. Avelina did not mention it at dinner. She did not tell Lady Purnell. The kindness existed entirely without audience, which is the only way to know whether kindness is real. That same week, late on a Thursday evening after the household had retired, Avelina passed her father's study on her way to the library. The door stood slightly open, and Lord Harlan's voice carried into the corridor with the unmistakable weight of a man who had already made his decision and was merely announcing it aloud. "Solaine's match will strengthen the family's position considerably once the younger girls are settled. The Danthorpe name will carry influence across 5 counties. A brief pause. Then another man spoke carefully. "And your eldest daughter, Harland, has there been any progress?" The silence that followed lasted long enough for Avelina to feel her heartbeat in her throat. "Avelina is not part of these discussions," Lord Harland replied flatly. "We have accepted the situation for what it is." Lady Purnell's voice came next, softer, but no less final. "My sister Gertrude has offered to receive her at Branton Lodge. The countryside there is pleasant enough, and it would resolve the questions people have begun asking." Avelina pressed her back against the corridor wall. Her hands were shaking. She stood there for a long time after the conversation moved on to other matters, staring at the darkened hallway ahead of her, breathing slowly through the understanding that her own parents were planning to remove her from the family home, the way one might remove an unfashionable piece of furniture that guests kept noticing. She did not go to the library that night. She went to bed and lay awake listening to rain hit the windows until the sky turned gray. The weeks before Selena's engagement celebration transformed Danthorpe Hall into something unrecognizable. Wagons arrived daily, carrying crates of French wine, bolts of ivory silk, arrangements of white roses, so large they had to be carried by 2 men. The kitchens ran without pause from dawn until well past midnight, producing pastries glazed with honey, roasted game birds stuffed with chestnuts and thyme, towers of marzipan fruit painted to look so real that a child reached for a sugar pear on the display table and cried when she could not eat it. Avelina supervised everything. She coordinated the florist, managed the musicians, resolved a crisis involving mismatched table linens, calmed a pastry cook who had burned an entire batch of almond cakes and was weeping into her apron, and personally inspected every guest chamber to ensure fresh towels, filled water pitchers, and properly aired mattresses. Solon spent those same weeks being fitted for gowns. On the evening of the celebration, Danthorpe Hall blazed with light. Hundreds of candles reflected off crystal glasses, polished silver, and the enormous gilded mirrors lining the ballroom walls. Guests arrived in carriages that stretched down the drive in a glittering line that took nearly an hour to clear. The air inside smelled of roasted lamb, warmed butter, cinnamon, cloves, and the sweet heaviness of too many flowers crowded into one room. Selene entered the ballroom on the arm of Viscount Aldrin Cavere, her engagement gown made from pale champagne satin that shimmered as she moved beneath the chandeliers. Diamonds hung at her throat and from her ears. She smiled as though the entire evening existed solely to confirm what she had always believed about herself. During dinner, the toasts began. Lord Harland praised the union with the gravity of a man signing a peace accord. Lady Purnell raised her glass with practiced elegance. Aldrin's family offered warm words about honor and legacy. Then Selene stood flushed with wine and triumph. "I want to thank everyone who made this evening possible," she said brightly. "Especially my dear sister Avelina, who managed every detail so beautifully." She tilted her head with exaggerated tenderness. "It is comforting to know that even without a household of her own, she has found a way to be useful." Polite laughter moved through the room. Fenella covered her smile behind her napkin. A gentleman near the far end of the table leaned toward his wife and murmured something that made her glance toward Avelina with open pity. Avelina lowered her eyes to her plate. She did not move her hands. She did not reach for her wine. She sat perfectly still until the laughter faded and the conversation shifted elsewhere. And then she continued sitting still because there was nowhere else to go. Later that night, long after the last carriage had departed and the servants had begun clearing the ballroom, Avelina sat at her vanity with her hair still pinned and her dark gown still fastened. The silence inside her bedroom felt heavier than the noise of the celebration ever had. A soft knock came at the door. Tilda entered, carrying a cup of chamomile tea, sweetened with a spoonful of honey. The maid had been with the household since before Avelina was born. A steady, warm-faced woman with calloused hands and kind eyes that missed very little. "I thought you might want this," she said, setting the cup on the vanity. Avelina took it but did not drink. "I am being ridiculous, Tilda. It was only a toast." Tilda stood quietly for a moment, then placed her hand over Avelina's. A blade does not stop cutting simply because the person holding it is smiling. Avelina's breath caught. She pressed her lips together hard and nodded once, not trusting herself to speak. Tilda squeezed her hand gently and left without another word. 3 weeks later, Selene departed Danthorpe Hall in a white carriage, draped with silk ribbons, waving to the assembled crowd outside the church, while Lord Harland stood proudly on the stone steps. Avelina watched from further back, holding her gloves tightly against the November cold. As the carriage disappeared beyond the tree-lined road and the crowd began to scatter, she felt something she could not name settle quietly into the space her sister had occupied. Not sadness exactly. Something more permanent than sadness. Before the household had even finished packing away the wedding decorations, Fenella announced her own engagement to Lord Osric Pennant, a rising political figure with estates in Derbyshire and a manner so controlled it was difficult to tell whether he was listening or merely waiting for his turn to speak. And each time another sister left, the walls of Danthorpe Hall pressed tighter around the daughter who remained. There had been a time, years before the silence and the dark gowns and the vanishing, when Avelina Danthorpe had been the most alive person inside any room she entered. At 22, she moved through the estate with quick steps and an easy laugh that servants could hear from 2 corridors away. She played the harp beside open windows during summer evenings, filling the garden below with music that drifted across the lawns until the light turned amber and the air cooled. She read constantly. Philosophy, history, natural science, poetry and French that she translated aloud for her own amusement while walking the gravel paths between the rosebeds. During dinner parties, she spoke with a directness that occasionally startled guests who expected ornamental conversation from the eldest daughter of a wealthy house. She asked questions. She challenged assumptions. She remembered names. Men noticed her during that time. Several asked Lord Harland for introductions. A few even discussed possible courtship with cautious optimism. But none of them held Avelina's attention long enough to develop beyond pleasant conversation, because none of them seemed genuinely interested in the things she cared about. They admired her face. They approved of the Danthorpe estate. They wanted to discuss hunting, property, and which families were ascending in social value. She wanted to discuss why certain books survived centuries while others disappeared, What drove explorers to cross oceans knowing they might never return, and whether the natural world contained more beauty than any human art could replicate. Then Emery Haldane arrived at Danthorpe Hall on a gray Tuesday morning in late spring, carrying a leather case full of specimen presses, 3 notebooks filled with pencil sketches of root systems, and absolutely no awareness of the social customs expected inside an aristocratic household. Lord Harland had commissioned him through a recommendation from the Royal Botanical Society. The Danthorpe grounds contained several rare plant species that had never been formally catalogued, and Emery, a young and increasingly respected field botanist, had been hired to spend 6 weeks documenting them. He was given a small room above the carriage house and permission to access the grounds freely during daylight hours. He was not given permission to speak to the family. That happened on its own. Evelina first encountered him kneeling in the mud beside the lower garden wall, carefully examining a cluster of ferns growing from a crack in the limestone. His coat was already stained at the elbows. His hair, the color of dark honey, fell across his forehead in a way that suggested he had never once considered how it looked. When Evelina approached and asked what he was studying, he looked up with genuine surprise, as though he had forgotten other people existed on the property. Asplenium scolopendrium, he said. Hart's tongue fern. This particular colony has an unusual frond mutation I have only seen described once before, in a monograph published in 1812. He spoke about the fern for nearly 10 minutes before realizing he had not introduced himself. Evelina found herself smiling in a way she had not smiled in months. Over the following weeks, something extraordinary grew between them, with the quiet certainty of a vine finding sunlight. Emery showed Evelina how to press botanical specimens between sheets of blotting paper weighted with smooth river stones. She showed him the estate library, and he stood speechless before shelves he had not imagined existed outside a university, running his fingers along cracked spines with the reverence of a man entering a cathedral. They spent long afternoons walking the grounds together while he explained the hidden architecture of plant systems beneath the soil, and she told him about the damaged books she had begun learning to repair, how pulling a ruined page back from decay felt like a small act of rescue. He listened to her, not politely, not strategically. He listened the way a person listens when they have found someone whose thoughts feel like a country they have been searching for without knowing its name. One evening, sitting beside the pond where dragonflies hovered above the water in the last copper light of the day, Emery turned to her with an expression so open and unguarded it made something tighten painfully behind her ribs. I have spent most of my life studying the ways living things survive against impossible conditions, he said quietly. But I have never understood the word resilience until I watched you move through this house. She reached for his hand instead, and he held it tightly, and neither of them spoke again until the stars appeared. Lord Harland discovered them on a warm evening in late June. He entered the library unannounced and found them seated together near the east window, Emery reading aloud from a volume of Keats while Evelina listened with her shoes removed and her feet tucked beneath her on the chair. The informality of the scene enraged him more than anything romantic could have. The confrontation happened that same night inside the study, with the door shut and Lord Harland's voice loud enough to reach the servants' corridor. You are a man who catalogues weeds for a living, Lord Harland spat with unconcealed contempt. You possess no title, no estate, no family worth mentioning in any society that matters, and you have the extraordinary arrogance to pursue my daughter under my own roof. Emery stood straight, despite every word. I love your daughter, sir, sincerely and without condition. Love. Lord Harland repeated the word, as though it tasted rotten. Love does not maintain estates. Love does not protect family names. Love is a word used by men without means to justify ambitions beyond their station. Evelina pleaded with her father for over an hour. She begged. She reasoned. She argued with a clarity and force that would have persuaded any man whose mind was not already welded shut. Lady Purnell intervened only once. placing her hand on Evelina's arm with a gentleness that somehow made the refusal worse. "Think of what people would say. Darling, we must consider the family." Emery was ordered to leave Danthorpe Hall by sunrise. Evelina found him at the garden gate the next morning, while mist still clung to the ground and the air smelled of wet stone and crushed grass. His leather case sat at his feet beside a single traveling bag. Rain had begun falling softly, darkening the shoulders of his coat. His eyes were red, but his voice was steady. "I will come back for you," he said, holding both of her hands tightly in his. "I will secure a proper position. I will build something they cannot dismiss, no matter how far I must go or how long it takes." She believed him completely. That was the part that made everything afterward so much worse. He wrote 3 letters during the first 2 months. Each one arrived creased and travel-worn, filled with descriptions of the landscapes he was crossing, the specimens he was collecting, and always, in the final paragraph, a promise that he was working toward returning. Evelina kept every letter inside a wooden box beneath her bed and read them so many times the paper softened at the folds. Then the letters stopped. Autumn arrived. The trees on the Danthorpe grounds turned gold, and then bare. Evelina checked the post every morning with a discipline that slowly transformed from hope into ritual, and from ritual into something closer to prayer. November passed. December brought frost so deep the garden ponds froze solid. January came, carrying silence. The letter that finally arrived in February was not from Emery. It was addressed to Lord Harland from a British consul stationed in a port city along the southern coast of Spain. Emery Haldane had contracted a fever during field work in the surrounding marshlands. He had been taken to a local hospital but had not survived. He had died alone, thousands of miles from everything he loved, with no family present and no final message recorded. Lord Harland read the letter at breakfast and set it beside his plate, without comment. Lady Purnell glanced at it briefly and returned to her tea. It was Tilda who brought the news to Evelina later that morning, climbing the stairs to find her in the library, holding the letter carefully, as though it were made of something that could cut. Evelina read it twice. Then the teacup she had been holding slipped from her fingers and shattered across the floor, sending pale brown liquid spreading across the wooden boards in a pattern she would remember for the rest of her life. She did not cry immediately. She stared at the broken pieces with an expression Tilda would later describe to the cook as the saddest thing she had ever witnessed in 40 years of service. She locked herself inside her bedroom for 6 days. She refused food. She refused conversation. She refused sunlight. When she finally emerged, something essential had been removed from her face. The quickness was gone. The easy laughter was gone. The directness that once surprised dinner guests had been replaced by a careful, measured quietness that never fully lifted. The harp she had played every summer evening gathered dust beside the window and was eventually moved to a storage room on the 3rd floor. The books she had once read for pleasure became objects she repaired for others, her own curiosity slowly buried beneath the mechanical comfort of restoration work. She still moved through Danthorpe Hall performing every duty expected of her, but she moved through it the way someone moves through a house after a fire, carefully, quietly, touching nothing that might remind her of what the rooms once held. And the young woman who had once believed love would find her learned instead, that love could be stolen as easily as it was given. She never allowed herself to reach for it again. Fenella's wedding took place on a bright December morning beneath skies so pale they looked like paper stretched across the horizon. The ceremony was elegant, efficient, and entirely without warmth. Lord Osric Pennant stood at the altar the way he stood during parliamentary sessions, with perfect posture and an expression that suggested he was already thinking about the next matter on his schedule. He kissed Fenella precisely once on the cheek, and only after the officiant indicated it was appropriate. Lord Harland called the match a masterpiece of strategic positioning. Osric's influence in Westminster had been rising steadily. and the Danthorpe name attached to his career meant invitations to circles that had previously been closed. Lady Purnell spent the reception introducing herself to political wives she had never met before, wearing a smile so constant it looked painted on. Evelina attended the wedding in a gray gown that nobody complimented. She sat in the third row of the church and watched her sister walk down the aisle toward a man who had never once, in 3 months of courtship, asked Fenella a question about herself that was not also a question about her family's connections. Evelina noticed this. Fenella did not. Within 6 months, the distance between them grew visible. Osric spent most evenings at Westminster or in private meetings at his club in London. When he was home, conversation between them was limited to logistics. Fenella began writing to Lady Purnell more frequently than before, long letters filled with descriptions of new curtains and furniture purchases that Evelina recognized immediately as a woman filling silence with objects. Meanwhile, Lucette's courtship with Bertram Halwick had moved with unusual speed. Bertram possessed the kind of charm that announced itself the moment he entered a room. He laughed easily, he complimented generously. He brought Lucette gifts every visit, each one more extravagant than the last: a pearl bracelet from Venice, a silk scarf from a London modiste, a music box inlaid with silver that played a waltz when opened. Lucette glowed under the attention like something finally given the sunlight it believed it deserved. But Evelina observed details that excitement made invisible. Bertram chose every restaurant where they dined. Bertram decided which guests were suitable for Lucette to entertain. During a weekend visit to Danthorpe Hall, Evelina watched him gently correct Lucette's opinion about a novel in front of 3 guests, not aggressively, but with the steady assurance of someone who believed his preferences should naturally replace hers. Lucette laughed and agreed with him. She did not notice the correction. Evelina did. When the engagement was officially announced, Danthorpe Hall erupted once more into the familiar chaos of celebration preparation. Wagons arrived carrying champagne crates packed in straw, enormous arrangements of white peonies and trailing ivy, bolts of cream-colored fabric meant to drape from the ballroom ceiling like frozen waterfalls, and enough silverware to furnish a second household entirely. Lady Purnell assigned the supervision to Evelina without discussion. "You understand the logistics better than anyone," she said, over breakfast one morning spreading marmalade across her toast without looking up. "Make certain everything is perfect." This is Lucette's evening. Evelina spent the next 12 days managing every detail of an event celebrating a life she would never have. She directed the hanging of chandeliers. She tasted wines and selected vintages. She negotiated with a florist who had delivered the wrong shade of roses and was now threatening to withdraw entirely over the disagreement. She mediated between 2 footmen who had nearly come to blows over responsibilities, resolved a miscount in the wine cellar inventory, and personally replaced a cracked serving platter discovered the morning before the event. Lucette spent those same 12 days selecting jewelry. 2 nights before the celebration, while carrying stacked tablecloths through the servants' corridor behind the kitchens, Evelina paused beside the partially open scullery door. 2 kitchen maids were speaking inside while scrubbing copper pots. "She has been on her feet since 5 this morning," one of them said quietly, "and not a single word of thanks from anyone upstairs." The other shook her head. "Miss Evelina is the only person in this house who remembers our names. My boy was ill last month and she sent broth from her own supper tray without being asked. You will not see the others doing that." The first maid lowered her voice further. "It is a crime, what they do to her. She deserves better than every one of them." Evelina stood completely still in the corridor, breathing carefully through the pressure building behind her eyes. She did not enter the scullery. She did not announce herself. She pressed her hand against the cold stone wall and let the words settle into the hollow place inside her chest, where almost nothing reached anymore. Then she picked up the tablecloths and continued walking. On the evening of the celebration, Danthorpe Hall burned with light from every window. The drive was choked with carriages, and the ballroom swelled with perfume, candlelight, and the combined noise of 300 voices rising beneath the gilded ceiling. Platters of roasted venison glazed in blackcurrant sauce, buttered asparagus, smoked trout arranged on beds of crushed ice, towers of poached pears drizzled with chocolate, and warm bread rolls dusted with rosemary covered every surface of the dining tables. Musicians played beneath an arch of white flowers, while guests moved through the room in silk and jewels, admiring one another and being admired in return. Lucette stood at the center of it all, wearing ivory satin that caught the candlelight like liquid pearl, Bertram's sapphire ring glittering on her hand as she received congratulations from every direction. She smiled without pause, and for one evening, she was everything she had always wanted to be, the most watched woman in the room. Evelina stood near the musicians, adjusting a loose candle that had begun leaning dangerously in its holder. Her dark navy gown, the same one she had worn to Selena's engagement, the same one she wore to every gathering because no one had offered to commission a new one, made her nearly invisible against the heavy curtains behind her. The evening unfolded exactly as it always did. Toasts were raised, compliments were exchanged, and when the moment arrived, her sisters did not disappoint. Selena's voice carried from the dinner table with the bright, careless edge of someone performing cruelty as entertainment. 3 out of 4, she declared, lifting her glass. 3 Danthorpe daughters married brilliantly. She paused, letting her eyes drift sideways. A pity we could not manage all 4. Fenella smiled from behind her wine glass. Lucette laughed with genuine delight. Lord Harlan did not correct them. He raised his own glass in silence, and drank without looking toward the far end of the table where Evelina sat with an untouched plate and hands folded carefully in her lap. It was Lucette who delivered the final blow, leaning across the table with a smile that contained no kindness whatsoever. Do not despair, Evelina. Perhaps one day we shall host a celebration in your honor, as well. She glanced at Bertram beside her, a retirement from society perhaps. The laughter that followed spread through the ballroom like something spilled that could not be gathered back. Evelina placed her napkin beside her plate. She stood slowly without speaking. She did not look at her sisters. She did not look at her parents. She walked toward the ballroom door with the steady, measured steps of someone who had practiced leaving rooms without drawing attention. For so many years it had become instinct. And then, just before she reached the door, a whisper cut through the noise behind her with the sharpness of something that could not be ignored. Duke Corvin Ashgrove lived inside a reputation that preceded him into every room he entered and remained long after he departed. His estate, Ashgrove Keep, sat on the edge of the Yorkshire coast, where the land dropped sharply into black cliffs and the sea churned against the rocks below with a violence that never fully rested. The house itself had been built by Corvin's great-grandfather from dark stone quarried in the surrounding hills, and over 4 generations it had grown into something that resembled a fortress more than a home. Tall, narrow windows faced the ocean. Ivy covered entire walls in a creeping darkness that gardeners had long since stopped trying to control. Inside, the corridors were wide and cold and filled with portraits of Ashgrove ancestors, who all seemed to share the same sharp jawline and the same expression of controlled displeasure. The estate employed over 90 servants, managed shipping routes that stretched from Liverpool to the Mediterranean, and generated wealth that made even London bankers speak carefully when the Ashgrove name arose in conversation. Corvin held influence in Parliament without holding a seat. He funded hospitals, invested in railways, and quietly purchased the debts of 3 noble families who had publicly opposed him, not to ruin them, but to ensure they understood the cost of miscalculation. Politicians treated him with deference that bordered on nervousness. Businessmen sought his partnership the way smaller animals seek the company of something large enough to provide shade. At 37 years old, Duke Corvin Ashgrove was arguably the most powerful unmarried man in England. He was also the most avoided. The reason had a name: Lady Celestine Morwood. Celestine had entered Corvin's life during the London season, 4 years earlier, with the precision of someone executing a plan rather than falling in love. She was extraordinarily beautiful in the way that made rooms reorganize themselves around her. Dark-haired, pale-skinned, always dressed in fabrics that cost more than most households earned in a year. She spoke softly, smiled at exactly the right moments, and complimented Corvin with a subtlety that felt genuine because she had spent considerable effort making certain it would. For nearly 8 months, London society watched the courtship with hungry anticipation. Newspapers printed speculative columns about the future Duchess of Ashgrove. Celestine's family celebrated privately, as though the engagement had already been announced. Corvin himself began to believe, cautiously at first, and then with growing certainty, that he had found someone whose affection was not a transaction. He was wrong. Through his personal steward, who had intercepted correspondence during a routine estate matter, Corvin discovered a series of letters between Celestine and Lord Edmund Vaith, a younger nobleman with considerable charm and considerably less wealth. The letters revealed that Celestine had been conducting a parallel courtship with Vaith for the entire duration of her relationship with Corvin. Her strategy was precise. She used Corvin's obvious interest to pressure Vaith into a competitive proposal, while simultaneously using Vaith's romantic letters to confirm to herself that she was desired for more than strategic value. She intended to accept whichever man produced the better offer first. The final letter contained a sentence Corvin read 3 times before setting the page down on his desk with hands that had gone completely still. "Corvin is the safer investment," Celestine had written to Vaith. "But you are the only one I think about when the candles are out." Celestine's scheme reached its conclusion at the Harrington Ball, one of the largest social events of the London season. She had arranged, through careful manipulation of the guest list and the cooperation of 2 trusted friends, for Corvin and herself to be found alone together in the private gallery, overlooking the ballroom. The situation was designed to appear compromising enough that social convention would demand an immediate engagement announcement. Witnesses had been positioned, timing had been rehearsed. When the gallery doors opened, and a small crowd of carefully selected guests appeared with expressions of practiced surprise, Celestine turned toward Corvin with a look of theatrical innocence and waited for the trap to close. Instead, Corvin reached into his coat and removed the letters. He read them aloud. All of them. In a voice so calm and measured that several listeners later said the silence between his sentences was the most frightening sound they had ever heard in a ballroom. He did not raise his voice once. He did not display anger. He simply laid the truth across the room like a white cloth spread over a table and let everyone present see exactly what was underneath. Celestine attempted to speak twice. Both times her voice failed before completing a sentence. By the time Corvin finished reading the final letter, the gallery had filled with nearly 60 guests who had been drawn by the commotion. Celestine stood at the center of them all, her beauty still perfect, her reputation destroyed beyond recovery. She left London within the week. Vaith departed for the continent shortly afterward, and was not heard from again in respectable circles. The aftermath reshaped how society treated Corvin entirely. Before the Harrington Ball, women had pursued him with ambitious persistence. After it, they avoided him with something closer to fear. The incident proved that Corvin could not be manipulated, could not be deceived for long, and would respond to betrayal not with emotion but with devastating public precision. Mothers no longer pushed their daughters toward him at gatherings. They pulled them away. Young, noble women who once competed for his attention now lowered their eyes and changed direction when he entered a room. Inside Ashgrove Keep, silence became the dominant sound. Corvin spent most evenings alone in his study overlooking the sea, surrounded by shipping ledgers, investment correspondence, and an untouched glass of dark tea. Invitations arrived constantly and were left unopened in a growing pile beside the window. He attended social obligations only when refusing would create political complications. And when he did attend, he stood apart from crowds, with an expression that discouraged approach more effectively than any locked door. His mother, Dowager Duchess Izmir, watched the isolation deepen with growing worry. She visited him one February evening, entering the study without knocking, and placing a plate of roast pheasant and warm bread beside his untouched correspondence. "You cannot build a life entirely from ledgers and silence," she said, sitting across from him near the fire. Corvin did not look up from the document he was reading. "I built one from trust once." The result was instructive. Izmir studied her son's face carefully. The sharpness that had always been there had hardened into something more permanent over the past 4 years, as though the muscles responsible for warmth had simply stopped being used. She was one woman. Corvin, not a verdict on all of them. He finally looked toward the rain-covered windows, where the sea was invisible in the darkness, but audible through the stone walls. A constant low thunder beneath everything. Perhaps not. But the lesson applies regardless. Izmir left that evening carrying a sadness she could not put into words. She feared that her son had not merely been hurt by Celestine Morwood. She feared he had used the hurt as material to build something permanent around himself, a wall so thorough that no warmth would ever reach him again, not because he could not feel it, but because he had decided feeling was a risk he would never accept twice. Several weeks later, a formal invitation arrived at Ashgrove Keep bearing the Danthorpe family crest. Lord Harlan Danthorpe requested the Duke's presence at the engagement celebration of his youngest daughter, Lucette. Under ordinary circumstances, Corvin would have added the envelope to the unopened pile beside the window without a second thought. But Lord Harlan had recently become involved in a consortium of industrial investors whose shipping interests overlapped with several Ashgrove trade routes. A complete refusal might create unnecessary friction during ongoing negotiations. Corvin stared at the invitation for a long time, turning it over once between his fingers before placing it on the desk. Walden, his butler, waited near the doorway. "Shall I send a declination, Your Grace?" Corvin paused. "Prepared the carriage for Saturday evening. One appearance, nothing further." The night of Lucette's celebration arrived beneath heavy clouds and a cold wind that bent the bare trees lining the roads between estates. Inside the carriage, Corvin sat in darkness, his black coat buttoned to the collar, watching the distant lights of Danthorpe Hall grow brighter through the rain-streaked window. He expected nothing from the evening except the same performance he had witnessed at every gathering for the past 4 years. Bright rooms filled with desperate people pretending to be something slightly better than what they were. He had no reason to believe this night would be any different from 100 others. He was entirely wrong. The whisper reached Avelina before she reached the door. It began somewhere near the center of the ballroom and spread outward through the crowd with the speed of something genuinely frightening. Voices dropped. Laughter stopped mid-breath. The musicians continued playing for several bars before noticing that no one was listening anymore and letting the waltz trail off into uncertain silence. "Is that Ashgrove? He would not come here. Why would he come here?" "Do not look directly at him. For heaven's sake, do not approach him." Avelina stopped walking. Her hand was still outstretched toward the door handle, her body still carrying the momentum of retreat, when curiosity turned her head just enough to see the far end of the ballroom. He stood near the tall windows overlooking the darkened gardens, where rain was running down the glass in silver threads. He wore black from his collar to his boots, and the candlelight from the chandeliers above did not soften him. It sharpened him. His face was angular and controlled, his dark hair pushed back from a forehead that carried the kind of tension earned by years of keeping every thought behind a locked expression. He held no wine glass. He spoke to no one. He simply stood, watching the room with the detached attention of someone who had already decided everything. Inside it was predictable. Every person in the ballroom had arranged themselves around his absence. The space surrounding him was enormous, a perfect circle of emptiness in a room otherwise packed to the walls. Women who had been laughing loudly moments earlier now stood quietly behind fans, whispering to one another with expressions that contained equal parts fascination and genuine fear. Mothers gripped their daughters' arms with visible force. Even Lord Harland, who had clearly invited the Duke for strategic reasons, seemed unsure how closely to approach, and was hovering near the dessert table with a frozen smile. Avelina watched all of this from beside the door. She saw the isolation. She recognized it immediately, not as power, not as danger, but as the specific kind of loneliness that comes from being in a room where every person has already decided who you are before you have spoken a single word. She knew that loneliness. She had lived inside it for years. She wore it the way she wore her dark gown, so constantly that it had become invisible to her, until she saw it reflected on someone else, and something turned inside her. It was not courage exactly. Courage implies the presence of fear, weighed against a decision to act regardless. What Avelina felt was closer to exhaustion. She was tired of leaving rooms. She was tired of standing near walls and watching the world perform around her. She was tired of the particular brand of cowardice that her family called dignity, the agreement to remain quiet and small and grateful for being tolerated inside a house that treated her like furniture. The most feared man in England was standing alone in a crowded ballroom, and not a single person had the simple decency to speak to him. Avelina released the door handle. She turned fully away from the exit, and she walked. The distance across the ballroom was perhaps 40 feet, but the silence that accompanied each step made it feel like crossing an open field. Guests noticed almost immediately. Heads turned. Conversations that had just begun to recover from the Duke's entrance died again as people realized what was happening. Selene's wine glass froze halfway to her lips. Fenella stared openly, with an expression caught between confusion and something that looked almost like alarm. Lucette stopped mid-sentence and turned to watch with her mouth still slightly open. Lady Purnell reached for Lord Harlan's arm without taking her eyes off her eldest daughter. "What is she doing?" Avelina did not hear the whisper. She kept walking. She did not adjust her hair. She did not straighten her gown. She did not rehearse a greeting or calculate the social risk of what she was doing. She simply moved steadily across the polished floor, through the empty space that surrounded the Duke like a moat, until she was standing close enough to see the faint lines of tension beside his eyes, and the almost imperceptible shift in his posture as he registered that someone had voluntarily entered his radius for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Good evening, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear, and carried not a single trace of flattery or fear. "You appear to be the only other person in this room who would rather be somewhere else." For a full 3 seconds, Duke Corvin Ashgrove said nothing. He studied her face with an expression she could not read, as though she were a sentence in a language he had not expected to encounter. Then something happened that guests standing close enough would later describe to friends who would repeat it across London within the week. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. Not quite. But the closest thing to one that anyone had witnessed from the Duke of Ashgrove in 4 years. "You are remarkably direct," he said. Avelina met his gaze without flinching. "I've spent enough years being invisible to understand that directness is the only honest alternative to silence." Something shifted behind his eyes. A crack in the wall so brief that anyone watching from a distance would have missed it entirely. They spoke for several minutes, standing together beside the rain-covered windows while the entire ballroom pretended not to watch. Avelina did not mention his wealth. She did not mention his estates, his influence, or his political connections. She asked him whether he found large gatherings exhausting or merely pointless. He answered that the distinction had stopped mattering to him several years ago. She told him she had read that the Yorkshire coast produced a species of wildflower that grew only on limestone cliffs exposed to salt wind, and asked whether it was true. He looked at her as though she had spoken to him in a voice he had not heard used in years. "It is true," he said. "Thrift. Armeria maritima. It grows in places most people consider too harsh to support anything beautiful." Avelina felt something warm and unexpected move through her chest around them. Whispers had escalated into something closer to open alarm. Lady Celestine Morwood's name was being murmured near the champagne table. Several women exchanged looks of disbelief. Selena had gone pale, gripping her wineglass so tightly the stem was in danger of snapping. Then, Duke Corvin Ashgrove did something no one in the ballroom had believed possible. He extended his hand toward the woman standing before him, the eldest Danthorpe daughter, the unmarried sister, the one the family had tried to erase from relevance, and he spoke clearly enough for the nearest 30 guests to hear every word. "Miss Danthorpe, would you do me the honor of a dance?" The question dropped through the ballroom like a stone into still water. Ripples of shock moved outward in every direction. Lady Purnell's hand tightened on Lord Harland's arm until her knuckles whitened. Lucette, whose engagement celebration this was supposed to be, stood completely forgotten beside a table of untouched desserts. Avelina's fingers trembled slightly as she placed her hand in his. "The honor is mine, Your Grace." The orchestra, sensing something remarkable was unfolding, began a waltz without being instructed. Corvin guided her onto the floor with a steadiness that contrasted entirely with the chaos erupting silently around them. His hand rested against the small of her back, warm and certain, while the room watched in stunned immobility. Avelina moved carefully at first, aware of every pair of eyes fixed upon her. "You seem uncomfortable," he observed quietly. She looked up at him. "I am unaccustomed to being the reason an entire room has stopped breathing." That almost smile returned, slightly wider now. "You crossed the entire ballroom to speak with a man every woman in England avoids. Discomfort does not appear to be something that governs your decisions." Something loosened inside her chest. For the first time in years, she felt seen. Not admired, not pitied, not assessed for market value. Seen. They danced the full waltz. She told him about the damaged book she spent her afternoons repairing, and he listened with an attention so focused it felt almost physical. He told her the sea was visible from every window of Ashgrove Keep, and that some mornings the sound of it was the only conversation he needed. She said she understood that better than he could know. He looked at her when she said it, and something behind his carefully maintained expression shifted again a second crack, wider than the first. When the music ended and Avelina stepped back, the ballroom erupted into whispers so loud they could have been mistaken for applause. She crossed the room to him. "Did you see her walk? Straight across. No woman has dared approach Ashgrove in years." "Who is she?" "That is the eldest Danthorpe daughter, the unmarried one." Corvin held her gaze for a moment longer than the dance required. Then he released her hand, stepped back, and gave her a bow so formal and deliberate that its meaning was unmistakable to anyone who understood aristocratic etiquette. But he had not bowed to a woman at a social gathering since Lady Celestine Morwood. Across the room, Selena's face had drained entirely of color. Fenella sat rigid in her chair, staring at the tablecloth in front of her as though it had personally insulted her. Lucette turned toward Bertram with an expression that was trying very hard to be indifferent and failing completely. And for the first time, in longer than she could remember, Avelina Danthorpe walked away from the center of a ballroom instead of toward the edges of one. Something had begun that neither of them fully understood yet, and neither of them would be able to stop it. In the weeks following the dance at Lucette's celebration, Duke Corvin Ashgrove began appearing at Danthorpe Hall with a frequency that made servants exchange glances and society exchange speculation. His carriage arrived on Tuesday afternoons, then Thursday mornings, then Saturday evenings, until the household staff learned to prepare his preferred tea, strong black Assam without sugar, before the sound of wheels on the gravel drive even reached the front windows. At first, London treated the visit as an entertaining curiosity. Gossip columns printed careful mentions of the Duke's unexplained interest in the Danthorpe family, without naming Avelina directly, as though the idea of the most powerful unmarried man in England pursuing the eldest Danthorpe daughter was too improbable to commit fully to print. Drawing rooms across 3 counties hummed with theories. Some believed it was a political alliance with Lord Harland, disguised as courtship. Others insisted the Duke was simply amusing himself before returning to his usual solitude. A smaller number whispered something crueler, that Avelina had somehow tricked him into sympathy through rehearsed vulnerability. None of them were correct. Inside Danthorpe Hall, the shift in how Avelina was treated arrived so suddenly, it felt almost violent. Lord Harland began inviting her to sit beside him at dinner whenever Corvin visited, asking her opinion on subjects he had never before acknowledged she understood. He introduced her to visiting businessmen with a warmth so unfamiliar that Avelina initially thought he was speaking about someone else. Lady Purnell's transformation was even more dramatic. New gowns arrived from London weekly now. Deep sapphire silk, soft gray satin, trimmed with silver thread, a pale green evening dress with delicate beading along the bodice that caught candlelight like dew on morning grass. Her mother appeared at her bedroom door each evening before gatherings, adjusting jewelry, smoothing fabric, offering opinions on hairstyles she had never previously noticed Avelina wore. "You must present yourself with more confidence," Lady Purnell instructed, while fastening a pearl choker around Avelina's neck. "The Duke appreciates refinement." Avelina studied her mother's reflection in the vanity mirror and said nothing. The affection was new. The motivation behind it was painfully familiar. But what grew between Avelina and Corvin during those weeks existed entirely apart from her family's sudden interest. It lived in the quiet spaces between public appearances, in conversations that had no audience and served no strategic purpose. One gray afternoon, Corvin asked to see the library. Avelina hesitated for a moment before leading him down the long corridor to the room she had guarded as her private world for years. She watched his face carefully as he entered, uncertain what a man who owned estates worth more than entire villages would think of a dusty room full of damaged books and jars of wheat paste. Corvin walked slowly along the shelves, running his fingers across repaired spines with the focused attention of someone reading meaning in textures rather than titles. He stopped beside the reading table where Avelina's current project lay open, a water-damaged volume of botanical illustrations from the late 1700s, its pages carefully separated with strips of blotting paper while the binding dried in a wooden press. "How long does each restoration take?" he asked. Avelina stood near the doorway, arms folded unconsciously across her chest. "It depends on the damage. That volume has taken nearly 3 months. The water reached the inner signatures, and several plates had begun to separate from the binding entirely. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that appeared whenever she said something that surprised him, not because it was clever, but because it was honest. "You rescue things other people have given up on," he said quietly. The words reached a place inside her. She had believed, no longer responded to warmth. On another visit, they walked the grounds together in late afternoon, while autumn light turned the oak trees along the lower meadow into columns of bronze and copper. Their conversations during these walks had developed a rhythm that felt natural and unhurried, moving between subjects with the ease of two people who had discovered they thought about the world in similar patterns. He told her about the sea visible from Ashgrove Keep, how it changed color with the seasons, steel gray in winter, dark blue in summer, and occasionally, on rare mornings after storms, a shade of green so deep it looked like something alive. She'd told him about the years she had spent restoring books alone in the library, how the work had saved her during a time she could not describe further without her voice breaking. He did not press her to explain. He simply walked beside her in silence for several minutes, and the quality of that silence told her more about him than any words could have. During a formal dinner at Danthorpe Hall attended by several neighboring families, Corvin was seated beside Avelina by Lady Purnell's deliberate arrangement. Midway through the meal, a visiting earl leaned across the table and addressed the Duke with the carefully measured friendliness of a man hoping to make a powerful acquaintance. "Tell me, Your Grace, what convinced you to venture so far from Yorkshire? Surely the London season offers more diversion than the Somerset countryside." Several guests turned their attention toward the Duke, expecting a diplomatic non-answer. Corvin set down his glass. "I have spent enough seasons in London to understand that diversion and meaning are rarely found in the same room. he said calmly. Then, without looking at anyone else at the table, he added, "Somerset has offered me something London never did." He did not glance at Evelina when he said it. He did not need to. Every person present understood exactly what he meant. Across the table, Selena's hand tightened around her fork. Fenella stared at her plate with an expression that looked as though she were trying to swallow something that refused to go down. Lucette turned toward Bertram and whispered something sharp enough to make his jaw tighten. The jealousy had been building for weeks. It was about to find its voice. Selene struck first. She began quietly, through conversations held in drawing rooms she knew would carry gossip efficiently. During afternoon tea with Lady Hargrove, a woman famous for distributing private information as reliably as the Morning Post, Selene sighed dramatically and shook her head. "We are all terribly worried about the Duke," she confided with practiced reluctance. "Evelina has always been, how shall I say, fragile. She has a way of appearing helpless that can be quite convincing to men unfamiliar with her nature." Lady Hargrove's eyes widened with the specific hunger of someone receiving exactly the kind of information she intended to redistribute before sundown. Within days, the rumor had spread through 3 counties. Evelina Danthorpe had manipulated the Duke of Ashgrove using carefully performed vulnerability. She had studied his reputation, understood his weakness for perceived authenticity after the Celestine incident, and designed an approach so convincing that even the most guarded man in England had fallen for it. Fenella contributed more quietly but no less effectively. She arranged letters to society acquaintances in London, expressing concern for the Duke's judgment, while implying that Evelina's unmarried status at 31 suggested something deeply wrong with her character rather than her circumstances. Lucette went further. During a weekend gathering at a neighboring estate, she ensured that Lady Celestine Morewood received a personal invitation. Celestine arrived wearing deep burgundy velvet and garnets that glowed like embers against her pale throat. She moved through the evening with the confidence of a woman who had spent 4 years preparing for a second chance. Her beauty remained striking, perhaps even more so now that time had added a sharpness to her features that youth had softened. Throughout dinner, Celestine positioned herself near Corvin. At every opportunity, she laughed at appropriate moments. She referenced shared memories from their time together with just enough detail to remind the room they had once been close. She touched his arm twice while reaching for a wine glass, both times with the precision of someone who understood exactly what casual contact could suggest to observers. Corvin responded to all of it with the emotional temperature of a stone wall in January, when Celestine leaned toward him during dessert and murmured that she had thought about him often during the years apart. He turned his head and looked at her directly, his only acknowledgement of her presence all evening. "You thought about what I represented," he said, his voice low enough that only Celestine and the 2 nearest guests could hear. "Not who I was. There is a difference you never learned, and I am no longer interested in teaching it." The color left Celestine's face so completely that the woman seated beside her asked whether she felt unwell. Later that evening, long after most guests had retired, Corvin returned to Danthorpe Hall to collect business documents he had left in Lord Harland's study during an earlier meeting. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the entrance hall and the faint sound of voices drifting through the partially open drawing room door. He recognized Selene's voice first. She makes herself pathetic on purpose. No man of his standing simply falls for a woman who has been rejected by every eligible bachelor in England for a decade. Fenella's voice came next, quieter but equally sharp. She is an embarrassment to this family. She has always been an embarrassment. The only difference now is that she has found someone naive enough to mistake her desperation for depth. Then Lucette, laughing. "Perhaps when he tires of her, and he will tire of her, things can return to normal. Honestly, watching her play the devoted innocent is almost worse than watching her sulk in corners." Corvin pushed the door open. The laughter stopped as though someone had pressed a hand over a flame. 3 faces turned toward him simultaneously, each one cycling through surprise, fear, and the frantic calculation of how much he had heard. Corvin stood in the doorway without entering the room. His expression carried no anger. That was what made it devastating. His face held the controlled, measured calm of a man who had already decided exactly what he was going to say and had no interest in being interrupted. "I have spent the past 4 years surrounded by people who disguise cruelty as concern and selfishness as sophistication," he said. His voice was steady and clear and cut through the room like a blade drawn slowly across silk. "I had believed this household was different. I was mistaken about the household. I was not mistaken about your sister." Nobody spoke. Selena's lips parted, but no sound came. "Evelina possesses something none of you have ever understood, and clearly never will," he continued. "She is kind, without requiring gratitude. She is honest, without calculating advantage." And she walked across a room full of people toward the one person everyone else was afraid of, not because she wanted something from me, but because she recognized something in me that no one else in that room had the courage or the decency to see. He paused for exactly one breath. "If any of you speak about her that way again, within my hearing or beyond it, I will ensure that the consequences are felt far beyond this drawing room." Then he turned and walked away, without waiting for a response. He found Evelina 40 minutes later, standing alone near the darkened garden windows at the end of the east corridor. Her arms were wrapped around herself, and her reflection in the rain-streaked glass showed tears she had been crying long before he arrived. She wiped her face quickly when she heard his footsteps, embarrassed by her own emotion as she always was. "Evelina," he said gently. She shook her head without turning. "I should not let them affect me anymore. I have had years to learn how to carry it." He stepped closer. "Carrying something silently does not mean it has stopped hurting you." She turned then, and the look on her face nearly broke him. It was not sadness exactly. It was the specific expression of someone who has been so consistently undervalued that kindness itself feels disorienting. "No one has ever spoken for me before," she whispered. "In 31 years, not once." Corvin felt something inside his chest shift with a finality that frightened him and steadied him in equal measure. He reached into the interior pocket of his coat and felt the small velvet box he had been carrying for 11 days now, waiting for a moment that felt right. This was not the moment. Not here, in a darkened corridor with tears still wet on her face and her family's cruelty echoing through the walls around them. But soon, very soon. The Winterbourne Ball was the single most anticipated event of the London social calendar, held annually in early December inside the vast marble halls of Winterbourne House, a sprawling estate on the western edge of the city that had hosted royalty, foreign dignitaries, and every family of significant influence in England for over a century. Attending the ball was itself a statement of status. Receiving a personal invitation rather than a general one meant your family had arrived at a level of social importance that could not be questioned. The Danthorpe family had received personal invitations at last, and everyone inside the household understood exactly why. The evening arrived beneath a sky heavy with the first snow of winter. Carriages lined the approach road for nearly half a mile, their lanterns cutting yellow paths through the falling white, while footmen in livery helped guests descend onto a candlelit walkway, bordered by ice sculptures and arrangements of winter roses, so large they formed archways overhead. Inside, the ballroom was staggering. Crystal chandeliers the size of small carriages hung from a ceiling painted with celestial scenes in gold and deep blue. Polished marble floors reflected the light of 1,000 candles, while orchestras played from elevated platforms draped in white silk. Tables stretched along the perimeter carrying roasted goose, glazed with orange and clove, towers of oysters on crushed ice, warm bread rolls with salted butter, sugared figs wrapped in pastry, chocolate tortes layered with cream, and champagne flowing from silver fountains into crystal glasses that never emptied. England's highest aristocracy filled every corner of the room. Diamonds, rubies, and emeralds flashed from throats and wrists and hair. Conversations layered over one another until the noise became a single continuous sound, like a river moving through a canyon of wealth and ambition. Evelina stood near a marble pillar at the far side of the ballroom, wearing the pale green gown Lady Purnell had commissioned, with small pearls threaded through her dark hair, and a quiet expression that betrayed how profoundly out of place she felt. Women younger than her, by a decade, moved through the room with effortless confidence. Their laughter came easily. Their beauty was the kind that required no effort to be noticed. Standing among them, Evelina felt every insecurity she had ever carried settle back onto her shoulders like a coat she had briefly been allowed to remove. Her sisters noticed. Selene leaned toward Fenella and whispered with barely concealed satisfaction, "He is not here yet." And look at her, standing against the wall like a servant waiting for instructions. This is how it ends. Lucette adjusted her diamond earrings and smiled. Surrounded by women half her age and twice her beauty, even the Duke will remember what his options actually are. Across the ballroom, Lady Celestine Morwood arrived in black silk and diamonds that caught the light with predatory sharpness. Her eyes swept the room immediately. She had heard the rumors of the Duke's courtship. She had not believed them. Tonight, standing inside the most powerful room in England, she intended to remind Corvin Ashgrove of what he had once wanted. The minutes stretched. Conversations continued. The orchestra played a series of elegant waltzes that filled the marble hall with sound. Evelina remained near the pillar, holding a glass of champagne she had not tasted, watching the room the way she had always watched rooms, from the outside, looking in. Then the main doors opened. Duke Corvin Ashgrove entered the Winterbourne Ball, and the atmosphere shifted as though someone had changed the pressure inside the room. Conversations faltered. Women straightened. The familiar pattern repeated itself. Mothers adjusted daughters. Young noblewomen lowered their eyes. The circle of emptiness formed around him as naturally as it always did, an invisible boundary that no one in England dared to cross, except that someone already had, once, weeks ago. In a ballroom far smaller and less important than this one, Corvin moved through the crowd with unhurried purpose. He acknowledged greetings with brief nods. He did not stop walking. His eyes moved across the room steadily, searching for something specific, and the attention of every person present followed his gaze, like iron filings drawn toward a magnet. Celestine positioned herself directly in his path, her chin lifted, her expression carrying 4 years of practiced composure. Corvin walked past her without slowing. He walked past the daughters of earls, past the nieces of cabinet ministers, past women whose beauty had been celebrated in newspapers and whose families had spent generations accumulating the kind of influence that filled rooms like this one. Then he stopped. Evelina looked up. He stood before her, close enough that she could see the snowflakes melting slowly on the shoulders of his dark coat, and the steadiness in his eyes that she had come to understand was not coldness at all. It was certainty. From inside his coat, he produced a small velvet box the color of midnight. He opened it slowly. Inside rested a ring unlike anything the ballroom had ever seen. A single diamond, clear and brilliant, set in a band of dark silver, with 2 small sapphires on either side that glowed the same deep blue as the gown she had worn the first night they met. The ballroom fell completely silent. Corvin spoke clearly without hesitation, and his voice carried across the marble floor with the weight of words that had been considered carefully and were being delivered without a single syllable wasted. "Miss Evelina Danthorpe," he began, "I have spent 4 years believing that sincerity was something people performed in order to gain advantage. I built my life around that belief. I was certain of it." He paused. The silence in the room was so complete that Evelina could hear the snow landing softly against the windows behind her. "And then you walked across a ballroom," he continued. "Not because you wanted something from me. Not because you were calculating what I could offer you. You walked toward me because you saw a man standing alone and decided that was not something you could simply walk past. Every other person in that room had already decided who I was. You were the only one who asked, Tears were falling down Evelina's face before she could stop them. She pressed her trembling fingers against her mouth, overwhelmed by the weight of hearing herself described by someone who had actually seen her. "You are braver than anyone I have ever known," Corvin said, his voice dropping lower but losing none of its clarity. "You showed kindness to people who could offer you nothing in return. You endured cruelty that would have destroyed lesser spirits and emerged from it with your compassion completely intact. You repaired broken things when the world around you insisted they were beyond saving." He stepped closer. The ring caught the chandelier light and scattered it across both their faces. "I do not want a wife who impresses ballrooms," he said. "I want the woman who crossed one. I want the woman who spoke to me honestly, when honesty was the most dangerous thing she could have offered. I want you, exactly as you are, exactly as you have always been." The ballroom held its breath. "Evelina, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Something broke open inside her that had been sealed shut for 9 years. A sound escaped her before she could control it. Not a word, but something closer to the noise a person makes when pressure that has been building for longer than they realized is finally, suddenly, completely released. Tears ran freely now. Her hands shook. Her chest heaved with the effort of processing years of loneliness, dismissal, grief, and invisible endurance, all colliding at once against the simple, devastating reality that someone had chosen her. Not despite who she was. Because of it. She nodded. Her lips moved twice before sound emerged. Yes. The single word broke the silence like a stone dropped into glass. Applause erupted across the ballroom in a wave that carried shock, admiration, and for some, undeniable shame. Corvin slipped the ring onto her finger with steady hands, and when he lifted her trembling hand and pressed his lips against her knuckles, the gesture was so tender and so deliberate that several women in the nearest rows turned away to hide their own tears. Lady Celestine Morwood set down her champagne glass, turned, and walked out of the Winterbourne ball without speaking to anyone. She was not seen in London society again that season. Solène stood frozen beside the dessert table, with an expression that had passed through shock and arrived somewhere closer to devastation. Fenella sat rigidly in her chair, her fingers gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Lucette pressed her hand against Bertram's sleeve, but Bertram was staring at the Duke with the expression of a man reassessing something he had badly miscalculated. Lord Harlan stood motionless near the entrance, his face carrying too many emotions to separate. Lady Purnell stood beside him, and in a moment Evelina had never once witnessed in 31 years, her mother was crying, not from pride. From the sudden, unbearable recognition of everything she had failed to see. The years that followed changed Evelina in ways that society noticed but only those close to her truly understood. As Duchess of Ashgrove, she did not transform into someone new. She simply became visible. The kindness she had practiced quietly for years inside Danthorpe Hall now carried the weight of one of the most powerful names in England behind it, and she used that weight with the same steadiness she had once used to repair damaged books. She visited workers' families on the Ashgrove estates personally, learning their names and their children's names, and remembering them without prompting. She opened the grounds of Ashgrove Keep during harsh winters, providing food and shelter to families from surrounding villages who could not survive the cold alone. She funded a small school near the coast for children who had no access to education and sat on its governing board herself, rather than delegating the responsibility to someone who would treat it as an obligation. Servants inside the keep adored her. They said she was the first person in the Ashgrove household in 3 generations who thanked them for their work and meant it. Corvin watched all of this with the quiet expression of a man who had placed an enormous wager on his own judgment and been proven right in ways he had not fully anticipated. Meanwhile, the marriages her sisters had celebrated so proudly fell apart along exactly the fractures that had been visible from the beginning. Viscount Aldrin Cavere's gambling debts finally exceeded what Solena's dowry and family connections could absorb. When creditors arrived at their London residence, Aldrin vanished overnight, leaving behind unpaid accounts, an empty safe, and a wife who discovered that the jewelry she had treasured had been replaced with paste copies months earlier without her knowledge. Solène was forced to sell the townhouse and retreat to a modest rental in Bath, where former friends quietly stopped returning her correspondence. Lord Osric Pennant's political career collapsed after a scandal involving misused public funds, dragging Fenella's name through every newspaper in England for 6 consecutive weeks. Osric responded to the disgrace by retreating into complete emotional withdrawal, spending entire months at a private club in Edinburgh, while Fenella remained alone inside an enormous house in Derbyshire that had never once felt like a home. Bertram Halwick's controlling nature, which Evelina had noticed during his courtship and which Lucette had dismissed as attentiveness, grew steadily worse after the wedding. He dictated her wardrobe. He screened her letters. He criticized her speech, her friendships, her decisions, and eventually, her worth as a person with such relentless consistency that Lucette arrived at her mother's doorstep one winter morning with a single trunk and the hollowed expression of a woman who had finally understood the difference between being admired. One gray afternoon in late February, 3 carriages arrived at Ashgrove Keep within hours of each other. They carried women whose expensive gowns had grown slightly worn at the hems, whose faces carried the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from the slow collapse of everything a person had been taught to believe would protect them. Evelina received her sisters in the drawing room beside the fire, where the windows looked out over the sea, and the sound of waves against the cliffs below filled the silence that none of them could yet bring themselves to break. Solène could not meet her eyes. Fenella sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the carpet. Lucette's lower lip trembled once before she pressed it still. Evelina looked at the 3 of them for a long moment. She saw their shame. She saw their fear. She saw the years of cruelty they had delivered and the years of consequence they had received. And she saw, beneath all of it, 3 women who had never been taught that love without condition was something that existed. She rang for tea. She asked Tilda to prepare guest rooms. She handed Lucette a handkerchief when the tears finally came, and placed her hand over Solène's trembling fingers without saying a word. Because in the end, the greatest strength was never in revenge. It was in remaining gentle after the world had given every reason not to be. And the woman who had once been invisible inside her own family became the one they all eventually turned toward for shelter. England learned what the Danthorpe household discovered too late. That real worth was never found in beauty, youth, or advantageous marriage. It was found in the courage to cross a room when no one else would, in the patience to repair what others had abandoned, and in the quiet, unshakable dignity of a heart that refused to become cruel, no matter how many reasons it was given. Outside the windows of Ashgrove Keep, wild thrift clung to the limestone cliffs above the sea, blooming in pale pink clusters against the salt wind and the rain, growing stubbornly in the very places most people believed nothing beautiful could survive.